Hi and welcome to this video on working with drums in the Yamaha MODX. In a future video I'll be going over how to create your own drum kits from scratch and to import your own drum samples into the MODX, but the purpose of this video is more of a general overview and to give you some ideas about how to use the drums on the MODX in a DAW environment, how to tweak the drum sounds or swap them for one that's more suited to your particular track. I'll be using Cubase as the DAW, as you get a free copy of Cubase AI when you register your MODX with Yamaha. So whilst there are a few things that are Cubase specific, if you prefer to stick to your existing DAW, you can still use some of the techniques we'll look at in that, or export the results from Cubase AI into your favourite sequencer. Now, the first thing you need to know about drums on the MODX is that they're mapped to the General Midi standard where appropriate. To illustrate that, I've got a version of Hallion Sonic over here, which is set up with a standard drum beat. Now you do get a copy of Hallion Sonic SE with Cubase AI. Unfortunately, while you do get drum samples and you get loops with it, you don't get this particular version of this sort of drum box layout that you get with a full version of Hallion Sonic. It is available as an upgrade, so you can do that if you wish, but really there's a much better way of doing working with drums in Cubase AI, which I'll show you later. This is just to illustrate the point that the drums are GM compatible. So here we have the Hallion Sonic and a beat that is set up in the sort of traditional drum machine format. Now we can drag a MIDI file from there straight into Cubase, and let's take another one for variation. So there's pattern number 3. Let's drag that one over. So we now have those two patterns in Cubase. Let's play those back. There we go. Let's set up our loop points so that they match, and we'll glue them together by right clicking, selecting the glue symbol, and there we go. We've now made that one pattern. Now we can say goodbye to that now, because really this was just to illustrate the point. Drums are laid out on the MODX in a General Midi format. So on the MODX I'm in performance category search mode and I have drums and percussion selected. At the moment real drum kit comes up by default. So let's take the drum pattern that we created using Hallion Sonic and drag it into MODX and hit play. So you'll see that all the drum sounds mapped across correctly, the kick, the snare, the hats, etc. Let's try another kit. And sure enough, when we select the different kits, you'll find that the vast majority of them are mapped correctly. Now, the reason I say the vast majority, not all of them, is there will be some drum kits that, for example, are made up of 24 different snares, or perhaps they're of Latin percussion that don't adhere to the standard kick drum, snare drum, hi-hats, etc. So you will find examples that don't work every time, but by and large, as you scroll through the patterns, you'll find that, as you scroll through the kits rather, you'll find that most of them are mapped correctly. So let's have a look at a couple more kits. Somewhere down here there is an RX11 for those of you into synthwave or sort of retro styles. There's an RX11 kit, and indeed Yamaha pay a little homage to some Roland kits which I've managed to go past. Let's have a look for them. There we are, analog T9 kit, no prize for guessing what that sounds like, and same for the T8 kit. So most of the kits you'll find on the MODX map correctly, but what if we want to change the, say for example, the snare sound in that particular kit? Well, if we go to, first of all let's select it, call it up, and if we go to the edit mode, you'll see these are common settings, common to that particular kit. If you tap those and select part 1 and close it, you'll see that if we select the snare drum, it's assigned to key D1, and if I play back that pattern, every time the snare hit occurs, you'll see that little LED in the bottom right hand corner illuminate. Same if we select the kick drum, bass drum, every time a C is hit, the little LED will illuminate. So let's change the snare drum by selecting SD, selecting the name of the sample in the top right, and you'll see that it's assigned to sample number, believe it or not, 5377. And by using the scroll wheel, we can change the sample assigned till we find one that we like. We can as well pitch up the sample. So if I select the course tune, other editing options are available. We can go into the filter mode and apply a filter. Again, we're just working on that particular drum sound at the moment, which was the snare. So if I roll the filter down, we're filtering off the top end. The high pass filter as well. Don't know why that's not visually represented, but you can hear it in action. Letting the high frequencies through and filtering out the lower ones. And there's even a resonance setting rather, which can bring out the frequency that you've selected. So quite versatile editing facilities. You've also obviously can adjust the level of the individual samples, how sensitive it is to velocity, its pan position, etc. Let's just investigate some of those. So I can take the level right down. So now we can hear the clap much more clearly, bring the snare back up. And likewise, I might want to pan it to the far right or the far left. There's also an EQ section, which you can actually go in and adjust the EQ settings for each individual drum. Quite useful. Now then, there will be occasions when perhaps it's not one of the bass drum, snare drum, the hats or the toms, etc. that you want to adjust, and it's one of the more unconventional sounds. So the trick to that is actually finding the sound on your keyboard that you want to edit. Let's say we want to go for this one. So, and we want to change it. So if we press keyboard select, it'll register the drum that we're hitting. I'm hitting middle C, C3, and we want to adjust that. So I'll go into oscillator section, which is set to conga T8. So I'll now select that and scroll through using the scroll wheel. And it takes you to similar samples because that's the order in which they're arranged. But as you can see, there are thousands of them. If I go through some of the weird and wonderful ones. Oodles and oodles and oodles of samples. Gone from 4,000 odd, I'm now at 4,219. Now, not all of these are percussion samples. A lot of these are actual instrumental samples, but there are still plenty of drum samples to choose from. So let's look at editing the track briefly within Cubase. If I double click on the part, you'll see that it opens up in a standard MIDI key editor. Now this isn't really ideal for drums. Fine if you're editing musical parts, but not much use for drums. So the way to do this in Cubase is make sure that part is selected, go up to MIDI and select Open Drum Editor. And here you'll see the drums laid out in a more traditional fashion. If you just touch them, you'll hear that that is indeed a bass drum. That's the snare, the hand clap, the hi-hat and the open hi-hat. So you can actually go in, and if we want to add more snares, let me just right click, select the drum stick, and we can now go in and have that adjust the velocities at the bottom. Let's listen back to that. So this is much more drum friendly. If you have this this little setting up here, drum visibility agents, if you have show all drum sounds, you'll get quite a big layout. I like to have it set to show drum sounds with events, so that it only shows the events that are recorded, and it'll narrow down the display to that. It makes it much more easy to use. So that's another advantage of the standard GM layout, is that you'll find that by and large these names are correct when you load them, when you're working with them inside Cubase. So let's close that up now. So let's have a look at another way that you can use drums once you've recorded them inside your DAW. Cubase AI as well comes with a lovely little drum plugin called Groove Agent SE. Now I've actually got the full version of Groove Agent, and I can tell you there's not much difference between the special edition and the full version. So it's very versatile what you can actually do with it. I've called up a kit called Collins Kit, which I believe is a reference to Phil Collins. It's CR78. And again, let's just drag that file down from the MODX into Groove Agent, and we'll have a listen to that. Again, everything is mapped correctly. Now then, I don't want to make this a Groove Agent tutorial, but you do get Groove Agent in Cubase AI, so you can chop and change. You may find there's a snare that you like in Groove Agent, and you perhaps prefer it to, or it's more suitable for the track than the one in the MODX, so you can interchange the two. You can work between them. You saw what I did. I just literally dragged that part down. You could you know, have your kicks on the MODX and your snares in Groove Agent. Experiment, feel free to experiment. But Groove Agent is a lovely little unit, and you can do quite a bit more editing within Groove Agent. Let's have a look at what you can do. First of all, there are 16 pads and 8 banks of 16, so you can get plenty of drum sounds within Groove Agent. You can literally drag and drop samples on top of the pad, and you can set them to either replace the existing sample, or you could even stack them on top of each other and set up different velocities. At the moment this is just a single sample. So let's swap out the snare sample. To do that, make sure the pad is selected, right click and select replace sample. So this is in the main edit page. It'll open up the last used folder, and in my case it was some drum samples from the Akai XR10. So let's move down to the first snare drum. Now, rather than, I can audition that straight away by just open if I know that's the sound I want, but perhaps I want to go through and audition all the snare sounds. So if I hit play now without hitting return, it's swapped out that particular sample, and now I just use the arrow keys to go through the other snare sounds. So that's the closest to the original sample, but for the purpose of showing you some of the editing side of things, I'm going to select that one. So I'll just select open. So there's lots of editing in a similar way to what we did on the MODX. So you can do the same sort of thing here. First of all, you can edit the pitch. As I say, this isn't a Groove Agent tutorial. This is just to give you a rough idea. If you have a look in YouTube for tutorials on Groove Agent, you'll find there's some excellent ones. There's also a filter section here. Now, I like to use the filter section, if I engage the filter here, to perhaps give a more lo-fi effect. If I select Tube Drive and put the snare drum on, I can filter off the higher frequencies, and I can introduce a bit of tube distortion just to dirty the sound up a little bit. And also the filter as well has its own envelope, but I'm actually going to adjust the amplitude envelope because I want to shorten that sound. filter back up a bit. Take the level down a bit. So it really is a versatile little VST. Highly recommend you have a look at that. And of course you could export your samples if you've tweaked something, got it the way you want it. You could export this back into the MODX, and I'll be showing you that in my next video, which will be creating drum kits from scratch and importing your own drum samples. So you can also do things as well. If you have a look in the well, you can import a loop, slice the loop up. You can actually work on the sample itself and adjust, say, the end time. You can just set the sample end position. You can set a fade out point like so, and you do the same at the beginning of the sample. Sometimes you might have a sample that comes in a little bit late. You can adjust it there. If I go to MIDI effects, you'll see that there are some quite interesting, this is set to flam at the moment. I'd need to experiment with the time and the dynamics, but there are drag, rough rolls. So if I hit, sounds a bit weird in this instance, and buzz. So these are done in MIDI. It's effectively repeating that note in MIDI. Very useful. And there's also a MIDI delay, in this case. The number of repeats needs adjusting. Lots of room for experimentation there. So let's try some other kits, because it comes with plenty of kits. Let's just select the first one, 29 Minutes to Jupiter. Have a listen to that. And we'll take another one. Oh yeah, something I haven't mentioned. Let's call up this one Ageless. Something I haven't mentioned about Groove Agent is that not only does it store the different drum samples, but it stores a variety of patterns that you can actually audition by clicking the pads. So if I click on this one, Groove 7. So there's a tom pattern, and you can actually drag and drop this into Cubase as well. So let's add that on to the end, and let's extend this, just covering up the end of the piece there. Let's move that and have a listen to this. Now we can instantly put that straight back into the MODX, so let's do that. Let's set up the loop point so it's just looping around the tom samples. Let's go back to Performance Select, and instead of that T8 kit, let's have something with real toms similar to what we're listening to. In fact, I think that was right back at the beginning. I'll scroll through using the wheel. Real drum kit is selected. Have a listen to that. So now we're hearing what originally started off inside Groove Agent. We've now got back inside the MODX. Thanks to the fact that everything's mapped correctly. So let's try that now with a Beechwood snare kit. And likewise, if we go in and edit the into the MIDI settings and select Drum Editor, we'll see, let me just get rid of that a second, we'll see that the, again, it's correctly labelled it 808 floor tom. Oh no, look, there's an error. It says 808 bass. Let's have a listen to the sound. We can, of course, let's call that a mid tom. You will find there are exceptions depending on which kit you're working with. You can also create what are called drum maps within Cubase. Again, it's really outside the scope of this particular video because this is more on working with the MODX. However, you can go in here and let's engage the drum map first. If I select the GM drum map, you can see that you can set an input note. So let's imagine you're playing this on a set of electric drums, and they're triggering perhaps unusual note triggers that trigger the snare. You can give it an input note and an output note and the MIDI channel, and Cubase will compensate for that and play the correct kick drum. So you can go through all the different kick drums, all the different toms, etc., set your kit up and map it perfectly. So if there's a drum kit that you're particularly fond of, or a drum machine, you can map that, create a drum map within Cubase and map it so that everything maps correctly for you. And there may well be occasions when you want to use drum kits on the MODX that aren't mapped to General Midi. So let's have a look at how you might approach that. So I'm going to call a patch up that doesn't adhere to General Midi. I know it's called Ethno Beat, so let's search for it. So in the search box in the top right, I'm just going to type Ethno, hit done, and the MODX will pull up in the performances that match the name Ethno. So that's the one I was thinking of, Ethno Art Beat. I'll hit enter, and you'll see that it's made up of one synth arpeggio and two different drum and percussion sounds. So it's a good way to illustrate some less than traditional drum sounds. Let's have a listen to what that sounds like. So let's record that into Cubase. In an earlier video I showed you how to set up the MODX to transmit arpeggios into your DAW, and I'll try and put a link to that video in the top right hand corner about now. But to quickly recap, the MIDI channel in Cubase needs to be set to all, any, or omni, depends on your DAW. In Cubase it's called any. The next stage is to make sure that Cubase is transmitting MIDI clock into the MODX, and in the case of Cubase you go to Transport, go to Project Synchronization Setup, and make sure that in MIDI clock destinations MODX 1 is ticked. It actually doesn't matter about the others. I had them ticked in an earlier video, but you can just have the one selected. I found that seems to work fine. And then the final setting is on the MODX itself. If you press the Quick Setup button and then go to Quick Setup, make sure that Art Record on DAW is selected inside the utility mode. So with all that selected, let's go back to the performance and record it into Cubase. So I'll switch the arpeggio back off again on the MODX. Let's tidy this up and drag this, if I can select it, back and switch on the looping so that the 8 bars are looped, and listen back to it. So that's successfully recorded the arpeggio into the DAW. Everything is tightly locked together, synced together thanks to the MIDI clock. But if we open this up and have a look at it, it's a bit of a mess, isn't it? Everything's all over the place. So we need to separate the 3 tracks worth of information that's been recorded onto one track into Cubase. And how we do that, again, I touched on this briefly, but if you go up to the MIDI menu and go up to Dissolve Part, go down rather to Dissolve Part, select it. We want to select separate channels. If I hit OK, you'll now see that what Cubase has done is actually muted this, which is why it's a different color. These 3 tracks now have been separated. So if we solo the first track, have a listen to it. That's what I would call the drum machine element. It's actually part number 2 if you have a look on the screen of the performance. And now let's have a listen at that's the arpeggio. And this is the ethnic percussion. So the bits that interest us for the purpose of this video are the percussion. So let's label this one drums and label this one percussion. And because there's so many different percussion sounds, I know they won't map correctly to General Midi. So let's have a look at a way we can approach that. Let's move the arpeggio out of the way. Let's be organized and label it ARP. And we're going to have a listen to the drum sounds. So if I call up the drum sounds, You'll hear there's like that 808 style bass going on. And go up to the drum editor. By and large, everything you'll be able to work out what's going on. That's actually not a hand clap. That's not a floor tom. That's one of the 808 basses. You'll find that the acoustic bass drum, yeah, these are the wrong names. So this is a good example of one where you might want to go in and rename. If it was a kit that we're using regularly, you could go and rename them or create a drum map. So let's look at that alternative approach that you can take. Here's the percussion track on one part. If we move up to the MIDI menu again, and this time select dissolve part, we can dissolve that part into separate pitches. And what this will do, if I hit OK, will put each of the drum parts on their own track. So every drum part there is on its own track. And we can go through and mute and solo each of the instruments. Let's imagine that we wanted to actually change this particular sound. Well, Cubase tells us that the sound in question is being transmitted on the key of G5. And we can see from the MODX that it's on part number 3. So if I select part number 3, hit edit, and then we need to tell it G5. So let's go to keyboard select and hit G5. There's the light that's lighting to tell us we've got the right note. There's what's being played. Let's select that and select an alternative sound. Let's go for that because it's obviously different. Again, we can adjust the tuning. Let's listen to it now in connection with the rest of the track. So we'll go back and solo the other instruments. So let's adjust the level a little bit. Let's pan right to the right hand side. And if we're happy with that, we can simply exit and save that performance away if it's something that you want to keep again for the future. And basically, this way you can go in and edit each sound individually quite easily and see what's going on. But we're left with an awful lot of tracks on Cubase. It's quite a good way of working, but we're left with a lot of tracks. So what I suggest you do is right-click, add a folder track, and you'll see it's created a folder above all the relevant tracks. Let's select all of them, pop them into the folder, and when you close the folder up, we can get rid of this one now because that was the original one. So if I right click, remove the selected track, and the folder track now, we could call it percussion folder. And if we solo it, there they all are, and if we open up the folder, you can still get at them for editing, but everything's saved away neatly in a folder. And that really wraps things up about the way of some of the different approaches you can take when working with drums on the MODX and your DAW. So soon I'll be showing you that video about creating your own drum kits, so do subscribe if you haven't done so already. Many thanks to those of you that have already subscribed, and if you do so, I'll keep you up to date with tutorials on the MODX and other synths, virtual instruments and various recording topics, and you'll be notified whenever I upload a new video. So for now, thanks for watching. Let's have a listen back to the end result.